A black boy bursts into a police station on a stormy night, clutching a soaked baby doll and screaming, "Arrest my mom!" His desperate plea shocks a seasoned officer, who soon learns that his mother has taken a white baby from a park, claiming it's her own. But what could drive a mother to such extremes? Is she truly a kidnapper, or is there a heartbreaking truth buried in her past? As tensions explode and shocking secrets unravel, this gripping story will keep you guessing until the very end. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Thunder cracked overhead as Xavier Jackson's sneakers splashed through puddle after puddle, his small frame fighting against the wind and rain. The 9-year-old's teeth chattered as he clutched a baby doll wrapped in a soaked blanket close to his chest. Water streamed down his face, mixing with tears he couldn't hold back. His dark hair plastered against his forehead as another gust of wind whipped around him, sending a shiver down his spine. The police station's bright lights pierced through the stormy darkness ahead of him like a beacon of hope. Xavier's heart pounded as he pushed himself to run faster, his wet shoes slipping and sliding on the treacherous sidewalk. His blue jacket, heavy with rain, weighed him down like armor, but he didn't slow down. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating his determined face for a brief moment, casting stark shadows across his young features. With a final burst of energy, Xavier crashed through the police station's front doors. The sudden warmth hit his cold face as he stumbled inside, leaving wet footprints on the linoleum floor like a trail of tears. Everyone in the lobby, officers at their desks, people waiting in plastic chairs, a janitor mopping in the corner, turned to stare at the soaking wet boy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his frightened face, making him appear even more vulnerable. "Arrest my mom!" Xavier screamed, his voice breaking like shattered glass. His legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees, gasping for air, still holding the doll tightly against his racing heart. Water pooled around him on the floor, creating a small puddle that reflected the overhead lights in a kaleidoscope of colors. Officer Louise Harris looked up from her paperwork, her kind eyes widening at the sight before her. She immediately stood up from her desk, her gray hair neatly pulled back in a bun, and walked over to the trembling boy. Something in his desperate expression reminded her of Lily, her own daughter who she'd lost years ago, that same look of fear mixed with determination. The familiar ache in her chest grew stronger, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached him, memories threatening to overwhelm her. "It's all right, sweetheart," Louise said softly, kneeling beside Xavier. She noticed how his whole body shook like a leaf in the wind. Whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. Goosebumps covered his arms, visible through his wet sleeves that clung to his skin. "Let's get you somewhere quiet, okay?" "Somewhere safe." Xavier nodded weakly, allowing Louise to help him up. She guided him to a small break room in the corner, away from the curious stares and whispered conversations. Louise grabbed a warm blanket from the emergency supplies cabinet and wrapped it around his shoulders. The soft, blue fabric enveloped him like a protective cocoon, offering the first comfort he'd felt since leaving home. "I'll make you some hot cocoa," she said, keeping her voice gentle and steady, like talking to a frightened animal. "Would you like that?" She moved to the counter where a small coffee station was set up, her movements deliberately slow and calm to avoid startling him. The familiar routine of preparing the drink helped steady her own nerves. Xavier nodded again, his grip on the doll never loosening. His sneakers squeaked against the floor as he settled into a chair, water dripping from his clothes in a steady rhythm. The doll's plastic face peeked out from its wet blanket, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead, a silent witness to whatever had transpired. Louise quickly prepared the hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows for good measure, and placed the steaming cup in front of him. She pulled up a chair and sat across from him, giving him space while staying close enough to show she cared. The sweet aroma of chocolate filled the small room, creating a comforting atmosphere despite the circumstances. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but in here, they'd found a moment of peace. "My name is Officer Louise," she said, her voice warm and reassuring. "Can you tell me your name?" "Xavier," he stuttered, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling like the last leaf of autumn. Xavier Jackson. His fingers wrapped around the warm mug, seeking its heat like a lifeline. "Xavier, can you tell me what happened?" Louise asked, watching as he took a small sip of cocoa. A chocolate mustache formed above his upper lip, making him look even younger than his 9 years, reminding her of happier times with her own child. Tears welled up in his eyes again, threatening to spill over. "My mom, she..." His words caught in his throat as sobs began to shake his small frame, each one seeming to come from deeper within. "She took a baby from the park. She said it was hers, but I know it wasn't." He hugged the doll closer, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly, as if it were his only anchor to reality. "I don't want her to go to jail. I don't want to be alone. Please." Louise felt her heart sink as she watched the boy struggle with his words, each one clearly causing him pain. This wasn't a simple case of theft. The pain and confusion in Xavier's eyes told her there was much more to the story, layers of complexity she'd need to carefully unravel. She noticed how his shoulders hunched forward protectively, as if carrying a weight far too heavy for his young age, a burden no child should have to bear. She made a mental note to contact Child Services while her team would need to locate his mother, knowing this case would require delicate handling. Looking past Xavier to the window where rain continued to pour in sheets, Louise felt an unexpected connection to this case that went beyond her professional duties. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous sound that seemed to echo the gravity of the situation, while lightning illuminated the darkness beyond the glass, matching the flashes of determination in Xavier's tear-filled eyes. Louise guided Xavier into the small interrogation room, her hand gentle on his shoulder. The harsh fluorescent lights made the boy look even paler, his wet clothes still dripping onto the floor, creating small puddles that reflected the stark lighting like tiny mirrors. She grabbed another blanket from a nearby cabinet, thick and navy blue like the ones they kept for emergencies, and draped it over his shoulders, tucking it carefully around him, making sure to cover his shivering arms completely. "Here you go, sweetheart, let's get you warmed up." She placed a fresh cup of hot cocoa in front of him, steam rising in delicate swirls into the chilly air. Xavier's hands stayed wrapped around the doll, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The worn fabric of the toy pressed against his chest like a shield against the world. The doll's faded dress was damp from his clothes, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "You're safe here," Louise said softly, settling into the chair across from him. The metal legs scraped quietly against the floor, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Take your time. There's no rush at all." Xavier's eyes darted around the room, taking in the bare walls and the large mirror on one side that stretched from floor to ceiling. His shoulders remained tense, but gradually, he loosened his grip on the doll enough to reach for the cocoa, his fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the warm paper cup. The sweet aroma seemed to offer him a small measure of comfort. "Can you tell me about what happened today?" Louise asked, keeping her voice gentle and steady, the way she used to speak to scared witnesses in her early days on the force. She leaned forward slightly, showing she was listening without crowding his space. Xavier took a small sip before speaking, leaving a tiny chocolate mustache above his lip that he didn't wipe away. "We were at Marshall Park this afternoon. Mom was pushing me on the swings like normal." His voice trembled and he swallowed hard before continuing. "Then she saw this baby with its mom near the sandbox. She got really quiet and weird, like she'd seen a ghost or something terrible." Louise nodded encouragingly, taking out her notepad, the familiar motion helping to maintain a sense of routine and normalcy. The soft scratch of her pen against paper filled the silence between his words. "She kept saying, 'That's Ellie, that's my baby.'" Xavier's eyes welled up with tears, making them shine in the harsh light like polished glass. "I told her it couldn't be, but she wouldn't listen. She just kept saying it over and over, like she was in some kind of trance. Her voice got scarier and louder each time." Louise felt her heart tighten as she watched Xavier struggle with the memory. The boy reminded her so much of her Lily. The same vulnerability, the same need to be brave in a scary situation, the same way of fiddling with his sleeve when nervous, just as Lily used to do with her favorite sweater. I tried to stop her, Xavier continued, his voice barely a whisper now, the words catching in his throat like fishhooks. But she wouldn't listen to me. She never acts like this, I promise. It's just been hard since Dad died. A tear rolled down his cheek, leaving a glistening trail that caught the fluorescent light. He got sick 3 years ago. Now it's just me and Mom. We're all we have left in the whole world. Louise reached across the table and placed her hand near Xavier's, offering comfort without pushing too far. The metal table felt cold beneath her palm, a stark contrast to the warmth she wanted to provide. That must be very difficult for both of you. You're being so brave right now. Xavier nodded, wiping his eyes with the blanket, the soft fabric absorbing his tears like a gentle embrace. I don't want to be alone. But I couldn't let Mom do something wrong. That's why I came here. His lower lip quivered, and he hugged the doll closer, burying his face in its yarn hair. Are you going to take her away from me too? Louise felt her own grief surface as she looked at this brave, frightened child. She thought of Lily, of all the times she'd promised to protect her daughter. Now, here was another child who needed protection. But the situation was far more complex than simple right and wrong. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on her shoulders like a lead blanket. We're going to figure this out, Louise assured him, though her mind was already racing with the implications of Amara's actions and the delicate balance between duty and compassion. Why don't you rest here for a bit while I make some calls? I'll be right outside if you need anything. She stood up slowly, her face heavy with concern as she stepped out of the interrogation room, leaving Xavier wrapped in the blanket with his Coco and doll. Through the window, she watched him curl further into himself, looking smaller and more vulnerable than any child should ever have to be. His reflection in the two-way mirror made it seem like there were two lost boys in the room, both equally scared and alone. Louise guided Xavier into the small interrogation room, its stark walls and metal furniture softened only by the warm light she'd switched on. Thunder rumbled outside as rain continued to pour, creating shadows that danced across the floor. The occasional flash of lightning illuminated the room in brief, harsh bursts. Here, sweetie, Louise said, wrapping another blanket around Xavier's trembling shoulders. She placed a fresh cup of hot cocoa in front of him, watching as steam curled up from the mug. The rich, comforting scent of chocolate filled the air between them. You're safe here. Take your time. Xavier's fingers remained locked around the doll, his wet clothes creating a small puddle beneath his chair. His shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor as he shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted around the room nervously before settling on the steaming cup. Can you tell me what happened at the park? Louise asked softly, pulling out her notepad. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, trying not to startle the already frightened boy. Xavier took a shaky breath. We were just having a normal day. Mom was pushing me on the swings. He paused, taking a small sip of cocoa, leaving a tiny chocolate mustache above his lip. Then she saw this baby by the sandbox. She got really weird and quiet. Louise nodded encouragingly, her pen hovering over the paper. The steady patter of rain against the windows filled the silence between them. She kept saying, "That's Ellie, that's my baby." Xavier's voice cracked. I tried telling her it wasn't true, but she wouldn't listen. She just kept saying it over and over. His fingers traced nervous patterns on the side of the mug. Tears welled up in Xavier's eyes. Ever since Dad died 3 years ago, it's just been me and Mom. She's never acted like this before. He clutched the doll tighter, its worn fabric bunching under his grip. I don't want to be alone, but I knew what she did was wrong. That's why I came here. Louise felt her heart constrict. The boy's pain struck too close to home, reminding her of Lily's similar vulnerability. She thought of her daughter's bright smile, now just a memory that ached in her chest. The weight of her badge felt especially heavy tonight. That must be very scary for you, Louise said gently, reaching across to place her hand near his on the table. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Being so worried about your mom? Xavier nodded, wiping his eyes with the corner of the blanket. His lower lip trembled as he asked, Are you going to take her away? Louise looked at the frightened child before her, understanding that this case went far beyond a simple matter of law and order. This was about a grieving mother, a scared little boy, and a desperate action that could tear their family apart. The responsibility of what came next pressed heavily on her shoulders. "We're going to figure this out," she assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Her voice carried a warmth she hoped would comfort him. "Why don't you rest here for a bit while I make some calls?" Standing up, Louise gave Xavier's shoulder a gentle squeeze before stepping out of the room. She closed the door quietly behind her, her face etched with concern as she considered the complexity of what lay ahead. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turbulent situation she now faced. The storm returned with a vengeance, rain hammering against the station windows as the clock neared midnight. Thunder rumbled in the distance, matching the tension building inside. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows across the worn walls. Carol Patterson burst into the room where Amara sat holding Ellie, with Robert trailing behind her like a shadow, his face pale and drawn, his tie askew as if he'd been tugging at it nervously. "She's a kidnapper," Carol's voice echoed off the walls, making Ellie whimper and bury her face deeper into Amara's embrace. Her finger jabbed the air toward Amara, trembling with rage. "She's not fit to be a mother. Look at her. Look at how she's dressed, where she lives." Robert placed a hesitant hand on his wife's shoulder, his wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. His fingers twitched slightly, betraying his unease. "Carol, please." His voice wavered with uncertainty, barely audible above the storm and his wife's harsh breathing. Amara pulled Ellie closer to her chest, her eyes fierce with maternal protection. The toddler's fingers curled into her mother's worn sweater, small hands seeking comfort in the familiar fabric. "I would never hurt my baby. Never." Her voice carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and worried tears. Louise stepped between them, her hands raised, assuming the stance she'd perfected over years of diffusing volatile situations. Her calm presence seemed to fill the space between the two mothers. "Everyone needs to calm down right now. We're going to handle this properly by the book." "Properly?" Carol's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical, the sound sharp enough to make Robert wince. "This woman has nothing. No job, no stability. She's clearly unstable." Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she gestured wildly, her designer watch glinting under the harsh lights. "She abandoned her baby, and now she thinks she can just take her back? After we've given Ellie everything? After all the birthdays and doctor's appointments? I didn't abandon her." Amara's voice cracked with emotion, tears welling in her eyes and spilling onto her cheeks. "They tricked me. They pressured me when I was at my lowest point. I had nowhere else to turn." Her hands gently stroked Ellie's back, an instinctive gesture of comfort. "You signed the papers," Carol shot back, her face flushed with anger, a vein pulsing at her temple. "You signed away your rights. The adoption is legal and binding. Ellie is our daughter now. We're the ones who've been there for every fever, every nightmare, every skinned knee." Louise watched Robert shift uncomfortably against the wall, his eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for answers in the worn linoleum. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he seemed to shrink further with each of Carol's outbursts, his shoulders hunching inward. A muscle twitched in his jaw, suggesting there were words he was holding back. "That agency took advantage of me," Amara pleaded, tears streaming down her face, leaving trails in her makeup. Her voice carried the raw pain of months of regret. "They knew I was struggling after losing my job. They told me it was temporary, that I could—" "Lies!" Carol's voice drowned out Amara's explanation, bouncing off the walls like the thunder outside. "All lies from an unfit mother. You're just trying to destroy our family. We're all Ellie has ever known." Louise noticed Robert flinch at his wife's words, his discomfort growing more obvious by the minute. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. His tie hung loose around his neck, as defeated as his posture, and his fingers kept fidgeting with his wedding ring. "That's enough for tonight," Louise announced firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. The authority in her tone made even Carol pause momentarily. "We need to investigate these claims properly before any decisions are made." She moved toward the door, gesturing for Carol and Robert to leave. Both parties will be contacted once we've gathered more information. This isn't helping anyone, especially not Ellie. Later, Louise sat alone in her office, the sound of rain providing a steady backdrop to her troubled thoughts. The case file lay open on her desk, illuminated by her desk lamp's soft glow, but her mind kept returning to the pain in Amara's eyes and the strange dynamic between Carol and Robert. Something about this case felt wrong, like a puzzle with missing pieces, and she was determined to find them. Thunder rolled outside her window as she began making notes, her pen scratching against paper with determined purpose. The early morning drizzle tapped softly against the station windows as Louise sat at her desk, steam rising from her third cup of coffee. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the scattered adoption papers before her, making her eyes ache from the constant strain. In the corner, Xavier was curled up on a small couch, his chest rising and falling with peaceful breaths, his worn backpack serving as a makeshift pillow. A police radio crackled quietly in the background, its occasional static breaking the pre-dawn silence. Louise rubbed her tired eyes and picked up another document, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Something didn't look right. She pulled out her reading glasses and leaned closer, frowning at the adoption agency's paperwork. Several mandatory fields were left blank and the dates didn't quite line up, setting off alarm bells in her mind. The agency's letterhead looked official enough, but the inconsistencies were becoming impossible to ignore. "This can't be right," she muttered, pulling another form from the stack, her police instincts kicking into high gear. Years of experience had taught her to trust her gut, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. Her eyes narrowed at Amara's signature on the final page. It was rushed, almost illegible, nothing like the careful handwriting she'd seen on earlier documents. The corners of the paper showed signs of crumpling, as if someone had gripped it too tightly, and there were what looked like old water stains near the bottom edge. The paper itself felt different too, somehow cheaper than the other documents in the file. Louise glanced at her watch and decided it was time to talk to Amara again. She found her in the break room, hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea, staring blankly at the wall as if lost in painful memories. The harsh fluorescent lights emphasized the dark circles under her eyes, and the worry lines etched across her forehead. "Nah, can you tell me more about the day you signed these papers?" Louise asked gently, sliding into the chair across from her, careful to keep her voice low and comforting. She noticed how Amara's shoulders tensed at the question. Amara's hands trembled slightly, causing ripples in her tea. "I was drowning in hospital bills after Xavier got sick. The agency, they said they could help." She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the cup until her knuckles turned white. "At first, they were so nice. They promised to cover all the medical expenses if I agreed to a temporary placement." "Temporary?" Louise pressed, leaning forward with concern, her expression softening with understanding. "That's what they said." Amara's voice cracked. "But when I went to sign the papers, everything was different. They told me I'd face legal consequences if I backed out. Said I'd have to pay back all the medical costs immediately." She wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. "I was alone, scared. They wouldn't even let me read through everything properly. Just kept pointing where to sign, rushing me along, like vultures circling their prey. The woman there kept checking her watch, making me feel like I was wasting their time." Louise spread the documents on the table between them, careful to arrange them in chronological order. "These forms are incomplete. And this signature here, were you rushed when you signed this?" She pointed to the hastily scrawled name, noting how it differed from Amara's usual careful penmanship. Amara nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "They said they had another couple waiting, that if I didn't sign right then, I'd lose everything." Her shoulders slumped, the weight of her guilt visible in every line of her body. "It was the worst day of my life. I felt like I had no choice, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The room felt so small, and they were all standing over me, watching." Louise gathered the papers, her mind racing with possibilities and connections. If what Amara was saying was true, this wasn't just a desperate mother's actions. It was a systematic manipulation by the adoption agency, a predatory scheme targeting vulnerable parents. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new detail. Back at her desk, Louise stared at the growing pile of evidence, her jaw set with determination. The morning sun was starting to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across her desk and illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. Nothing about this case was as straightforward as it had first appeared. She needed more proof, more documentation to support Amara's story. But one thing was becoming clear. There was much more to investigate than a simple kidnapping. This was about justice, about righting a wrong that went far deeper than she'd initially suspected. She pulled out a fresh notepad and began jotting down names and dates, determined to uncover every hidden detail of this increasingly complex case. The morning sun poured through the station windows, casting long, soft shadows that danced across the floor. Louise glanced up from her mountain of paperwork, her eyes drawn to a quiet corner of the room. There, Xavier sat cross-legged on a bright plastic chair, his small frame hunched over something precious in his lap. His tiny fingers moved with careful precision across a piece of paper, the gentle scratch of crayon against its surface barely piercing the stillness of the air. Each stroke seemed to carry the weight of his young heart. After several minutes of focused work, he stood up, his steps hesitant yet filled with determination. With a deep breath, he walked over to Louise's desk, a mix of shyness and resolve etched on his face. Without uttering a word, he placed his crayon drawing in front of her. It was a tender illustration of three figures holding hands: a tall woman with curly hair, a boy standing proudly in the middle, and a tiny baby. Their stick-figure faces radiated joy with big, beaming smiles that seemed to leap off the page. "Please help my mom," Xavier whispered, his voice trembling ever so slightly, revealing the weight of his worry. "She's all I have." Louise felt her heart tighten at his plea. She gestured for him to take a seat beside her desk, inviting him into her world of compassion. "Tell me about your mom, Xavier," she encouraged, eager to hear the story behind the drawing. His eyes sparkled with warmth, momentarily brightening despite the exhaustion that lined his features. "She's the best mom ever," he began, his excitement bubbling to the surface. "Last month, when I got the part in the school play, she stayed up all night making my costume. She didn't even have money to buy one, but she found some old clothes and turned them into something amazing." Louise leaned forward, captivated by the way his face softened as he recalled the memory, each word painting a vivid picture of their bond. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice growing quieter, almost a whisper, "I see her give me more food and take less for herself. She thinks I don't notice, but I do." He nervously twisted the hem of his shirt between his fingers, a sign of his unease. "One time when I was sick, she missed work to take care of me. She lost that job, but she didn't even get mad. She just wanted to be there for me." Each word struck Louise like a physical blow, stirring up bittersweet memories of her own daughter, Lily. Her laughter, her radiant smile, the choices Louise had made in the shadow of loss. She glanced back at Xavier's drawing, seeing the love and hope captured in those simple crayon lines, a snapshot of a family's spirit. "She's not a bad person," Xavier insisted, his eyes wide with pleading sincerity. "She just misses Ellie so much." In that moment, Louise reached across the desk, her hand finding his and squeezing it gently, offering him comfort. "I'll do everything I can," she promised, her voice steady and filled with warmth and conviction. For the very first time since arriving at the station, a smile broke across Xavier's face, a small yet hopeful expression that lit up his features, making him look like the child he truly was. Louise felt a shift within her, a renewed sense of purpose sprouting to life. She knew that pursuing this case might put her career at risk, but as she looked at Xavier's grateful face, filled with trust and hope, she found she couldn't bring herself to care. Thunder rumbled outside the Pattersons' elegant two-story home, echoing through rooms filled with expensive furniture but little warmth. In the living room, Carol gripped her wine glass tightly, her knuckles white against the crystal stem. The red liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim with each of her agitated movements. A family photo on the mantel showed happier times. Carol, Robert, and little Ellie at the beach last summer. All smiles and sunshine. Robert sat across from her in his leather armchair, his eyes fixed on the carpet as his fingers drummed an anxious rhythm on the armrest. The tension between them was as thick as the storm clouds outside. "I can't believe you just stood there," Carol finally burst out, her voice sharp. "While that woman held our baby, you didn't say a word, not one single word to defend us." Her hands shook as she gestured wildly, wine threatening to spill onto the cream-colored carpet. Robert's fingers stopped their tapping. "Carol." "No, she's dangerous, Robert, a kidnapper, and you looked like you felt sorry for her." Carol took another large sip of wine, nearly draining the glass. The crystal caught the light from a flash of lightning outside. "Do you have any idea how weak that made us look? Everyone in that courthouse saw you wavering. Maybe we need to consider." "Consider what?" Carol cut him off again, her voice rising with each word. She stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. "That some unstable woman who gave up her rights should take our daughter? Is that what you want?" Robert straightened in his chair, finally meeting his wife's gaze. His face was drawn with worry lines that hadn't been there a month ago, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. The adoption did feel rushed. All those papers they had us sign in such a hurry, the way they pressured us to finalize everything before the waiting period. You have to admit something wasn't right. "Don't you dare!" Carol's voice cracked like brittle glass. She pressed a hand to her chest as if physically holding back her pain. "Don't you dare question this now. After everything we've been through, all the failed IVF treatments, all the disappointments." Tears welled in her eyes, mascara threatening to run. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. "Ellie is ours. We're her parents. We've raised her since she was 3 days old." "I'm just saying maybe we need to think about what's best for Ellie," Robert said quietly, his words heavy with reluctance. "Not just about what we want." Carol recoiled as if she'd been slapped, pressing herself against the back of the couch. The thunder outside matched the storm in her heart. "What's best for Ellie is staying with her real parents, us. How can you even—" She set down her glass with shaking hands, nearly missing the coffee table. "After watching me go through treatment after treatment, watching me cry every time it failed, and now you're taking her side. After everything we've built together?" Robert stood up, running his hands through his hair in frustration. The silver at his temples seemed more pronounced in the dim evening light, a testament to the stress of recent weeks. "I'm not taking sides. I'm trying to do the right thing. The right thing is protecting our family." Carol's voice rose hysterically, bouncing off the pristine walls. Her mascara-stained tears left dark tracks down her cheeks. "But clearly you don't care about that anymore." Without another word, Robert left the room, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors. The sound of his departure echoed through the house like another crack of thunder. Carol remained on the couch, trembling as tears spilled down her cheeks. She picked up her wineglass again, whispering into the empty room, "Ellie is mine. She'll always be mine." Her words hung in the air like a desperate prayer, drowned out by the relentless storm outside. Louise arrived at the station early the next morning, her determination visible in every purposeful step. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning as her mind raced with questions about Amara's case. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders as she walked through the quiet hallways. Setting her coffee down, she spread the adoption documents across her desk and picked up her phone, her fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. "This is Officer Harris. I need all records related to New Hope Adoption Agency for the past year, particularly anything involving Amara Jackson." She paused, listening to the clerk's response, her free hand drumming anxiously on the desk. "Yes, and I'll need Mercy Hospital's billing records for Ms. Jackson as well. This is time-sensitive." The morning bustle of the station faded into background noise as Louise immersed herself in the paperwork. Officers walked past her desk, phones rang, and the coffee machine hummed in the distance, but she remained focused, her eyes scanning every detail with the intensity of a hawk. The stack of papers before her held secrets she was determined to uncover. 3 hours into her investigation, Louise's hand froze over a document. Her heart began to race as she read the details of a financial transaction, and her coffee sat forgotten and cold beside her. The adoption agency had paid Mercy Hospital directly for Amara's medical bills, $15,000, on the same day she signed away her parental rights. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental. "This can't be legal," Louise muttered, pulling out a highlighter with shaking fingers. She marked the date and amount, then reached for another stack of papers, her jaw set with determination. The yellow marks seemed to glow accusingly on the white paper. The more she dug, the worse it looked. Consent forms were missing required signatures, some pages appearing hastily processed. The timeline between Ellie's birth and her adoption was suspiciously short, just 2 days. Standard waiting periods had been completely ignored, as if someone had deliberately rushed the process through the system. Louise pulled out a fresh notepad and started making a list, her handwriting growing more urgent with each line. She flipped through more files, her concern growing with each passing minute. Similar patterns emerged in other cases: vulnerable mothers, rushed adoptions, financial incentives. The pieces were fitting together to form a disturbing picture. This wasn't just about Amara anymore. The agency seemed to have a system for targeting women in desperate situations, preying on their vulnerability. Gathering the most damning documents, Louise stared at them for a long moment, her thoughts drifting to her own daughter, Lily. These papers could change everything, for Amara, for Ellie, and possibly for many other mothers, but using them meant challenging not just the adoption agency, but the entire system that allowed such practices to continue unchecked. With steady hands that belied her inner turmoil, Louise picked up her phone and dialed her superior's number. She knew what this could cost her reputation, maybe even her career, but she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she finally had proof of wrongdoing. "Captain Mason? We need to talk about the Jackson case. I've found something you need to see. It's worse than we thought." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Louise sat in her car outside Robert Patterson's office building. Her fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she stared at her phone, her heart racing with anticipation. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she dialed his number, silently praying he would answer. It went to voicemail, her stomach sinking slightly. "Mr. Patterson, this is Officer Harris. I need to speak with you privately about Ellie's adoption. Please call me back when you can." She hung up, not expecting a quick response, and settled back against her seat with a weary sigh. To her surprise, her phone rang barely 2 minutes later, making her jump. "Officer Harris? This is Robert. I can meet you after work. Would that work for you?" An hour later, they sat across from each other in a quiet corner of the Daily Grind coffee shop. The rich smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Louise pulled out her folder of documents, carefully arranging them on the wooden table. Robert looked tired, his tie loosened and his shoulders tense, dark circles visible under his eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," Louise began, spreading several papers on the table between their steaming cups. "I've found some concerning details about how Ellie's adoption was handled. Things that don't add up." She pointed to the highlighted sections, her finger tracing each line as she explained each irregularity. The agency paid Amara's hospital bills the same day she signed away her rights. There's no record of proper counseling, and the whole process was rushed through in just 2 days. That's extremely unusual for an adoption case. Robert's face fell as he examined the documents, the color draining from his cheeks. He ran a hand through his graying hair and sighed deeply, his fingers trembling slightly. "I knew something felt off," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way they pushed everything through so quickly. But Carol was so excited. After years of trying to have a baby, this seemed like our miracle. We didn't want to question it." "Did you ever question the agency's methods?" Louise asked gently, keeping her voice soft and non-judgmental. Robert nodded slowly, guilt etched across his features. "I'm a lawyer. I should have asked more questions. I know better than this. But Carol was so afraid of losing another chance at motherhood. I I convinced myself it was all okay. We both did. Louise leaned forward, her eyes filled with compassion but determination. Mr. Patterson, I believe this agency has been taking advantage of vulnerable mothers. Amara was in crisis when she made this decision, barely able to think straight. Don't you think Ellie deserves to know the truth about how she came to your family? Robert stared into his untouched coffee, watching the steam rise in slow spirals. Carol will never agree to look into this. She's terrified of losing Ellie. It would destroy her. But what about what's right for Ellie? Louise pressed, her voice gentle but firm. Don't you think she deserves to know her whole story? Every child should know where they come from. Robert stood up slowly, gathering his coat with shaking hands. Thank you for showing me this, Officer Harris. I need some time to think. It's a lot to process. Louise watched him walk away through the coffee shop window, hoping she'd planted enough doubt to make a difference. His slumped shoulders told her he carried a heavy burden of guilt, and she could see the weight of her revelations in every step he took. But whether he'd find the courage to act on it remained to be seen. She gathered her documents, knowing she'd done what she could for now. The evening sun filtered through the dining room windows as Carol and Robert sat at their elegant mahogany table, the golden light casting long shadows across their faces. The only sounds were the quiet clink of silverware against plates and Carol's occasional sharp sighs, each one more pointed than the last. She pushed her green beans around listlessly, barely eating, creating abstract patterns on her barely touched plate. Robert watched his wife, his stomach in knots, his own appetite completely gone. He knew what he had to say would hurt her, but he couldn't keep it secret any longer. Carol, he began softly, his voice gentle but firm, I need to tell you something. She looked up, her fork pausing midair, tension immediately visible in her shoulders. What is it? I met with Officer Harris today. The words hung heavy in the air between them like storm clouds. Carol's fork clattered onto her plate with a jarring sound that seemed to echo through the room. You what? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but filled with disbelief and the first hints of betrayal. She showed me some documents about the adoption. There are things that don't add up, inconsistencies that we need to… Don't add up? Carol's voice rose sharply, cutting through his explanation like a knife. The only thing that doesn't add up is my husband going behind my back to meet with someone who's trying to destroy our family. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech. How could you do this to us? To me. Her hands trembled at her sides. Carol, please. Robert reached for her hand, but she pulled away as if his touch burned. I'm just trying to make sure everything was done right. Done right? Carol's face flushed red, her eyes bright with fury and fear. What about all the years we spent trying to have a baby? All the failed IVF treatments? The miscarriages? Have you forgotten how long we waited for Ellie? How many nights I cried myself to sleep? Tears streamed down her face now, leaving mascara trails on her cheeks. She's our miracle, Robert. Our baby. And now you're helping them take her away? Her voice cracked with raw emotion. Nobody's taking her away, Robert tried to reason, though his own voice wavered. I just think we need to consider… Consider what? Carol's voice cracked like thin ice. Consider giving up our daughter? The one thing that finally made us a real family? She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking small and vulnerable like a wounded animal. If we lose her, I'll have nothing left, don't you understand that? She's everything to me. Everything. Robert sat helplessly at the table, torn between his growing conscience and the sight of his wife's pain. The distance between them seemed to grow with each passing second. Carol, I love Ellie too. But if something wasn't right about how we got her… Stop it! Carol slammed her hand on the table, making the dishes jump. Just stop it! She turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I can't believe you're doing this to us. I can't believe you're betraying your own family. Without another word, she stormed out of the dining room, leaving Robert alone with their half-eaten dinner and the weight of his impossible choice. He stared at the family photo on the wall, Carol holding Ellie, both of them smiling brightly at the camera, a moment of perfect happiness frozen in time. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical thing as he sat in the growing darkness, the evening sun's last rays fading away. The morning sun streamed through the police station windows as Louise settled at her desk, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. Her determination showed in the way she attacked her keyboard, pulling up records and making calls. Each new piece of information about the adoption agency only fueled her suspicions, making her fingers move faster across the keys. "Yes, I understand this is sensitive," she said into the phone, her voice firm but gentle. "But anything you can tell me would help." She'd been calling former employees all morning, following leads that might shed light on the agency's practices. The growing stack of Post-it notes beside her computer showed how many dead ends she'd already hit. Finally, after her 12th call, she got a breakthrough. Margaret Stevens, who'd worked at the agency for 3 years, agreed to meet. "But somewhere private," Margaret had insisted, her voice trembling. "I could lose everything if they find out I talked." The fear in her voice told Louise this might be exactly what she'd been looking for. An hour later, Louise sat in a corner booth at Joe's Diner, watching the door. The lunch crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few regulars scattered around the worn tables. Margaret walked in, a thin woman in her 40s wearing oversized sunglasses. She slid into the booth, hands shaking as she removed her glasses, revealing dark circles under her eyes. "I shouldn't be here," Margaret whispered, glancing around nervously, her fingers fidgeting with a paper napkin. Louise pushed a cup of coffee toward her. "You're doing the right thing. Tell me what you know." She kept her voice low and reassuring, trying to put the frightened woman at ease. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "They had a system," she began quietly. "They looked for specific types, single mothers, usually with money problems. The more desperate, the better. They called them prime candidates in their internal meetings." Louise's pen moved quickly across her notepad as Margaret continued, her handwriting growing messier with each shocking detail. "They'd tell these women they were helping them, but really..." Margaret's voice cracked. "They'd pressure them, make them feel worthless, tell them their babies deserved better. Some of the counselors even got bonuses for successful adoptions." "And Amara Jackson?" Louise prompted gently, her heart aching at what she was hearing. Margaret nodded, her lip quivering. "I remember her case. They gave her papers while she was still on pain medication after the birth, told her she had to sign right then or she'd be responsible for massive hospital bills." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "It wasn't just her. There were at least 6 others I know of, treated the same way. Young mothers who never stood a chance." Louise's pen paused. "Would you be willing to make an official statement?" Margaret's hands trembled harder, rattling the coffee cup against its saucer. "I could lose my current job, my reputation... "I'll protect your identity," Louise assured her, reaching across the table to steady the shaking cup. "But this information could help make things right." Margaret took a deep breath and nodded slowly. These women deserved better. Their babies deserved better. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. "I kept copies of some documents. Dates, names, procedures that weren't exactly legal. I always knew someday someone would need to know the truth. I've been carrying this around for months, waiting for the right person to give it to." Louise carefully took the drive, her heart pounding with the weight of what it might contain. "Thank you, Margaret. You're very brave." As Margaret hurried out of the diner, pulling her sunglasses back on and clutching her purse close, Louise sat back in her booth, studying her notes. The pieces were finally coming together, forming a picture that made her stomach churn. She gathered her things, knowing she had what she needed to start building a real case against the agency. The flash drive felt heavy in her pocket, heavy with the truth that could change everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Captain Mason's office windows as Louise stepped inside, the golden light making dust motes dance in the air. Her heart beat a little faster when she heard the door click shut behind her, the sound feeling oddly final. Mason's expression was stern as he settled into his worn leather chair. His jaw set tight as he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Sit down, Harris," he said, his voice clipped and formal, like a principal about to scold a wayward student. Louise lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, keeping her face neutral despite the tension crackling in the air between them. "What exactly do you think you're doing with this adoption agency investigation?" Mason's words came out sharp and direct, each syllable precise as a knife edge. "You're supposed to be working the kidnapping case, not launching some crusade against a legitimate business." "Sir, with all due respect, these issues are connected," Louise replied, keeping her voice steady while her fingers pressed against her thigh. "The agency's practices directly influenced—" Mason's hand came down hard on his desk, making his coffee mug rattle. "Enough! This isn't your jurisdiction, and you know it. You're a good officer, Harris, but you're getting too personally involved here." Louise sat straighter in her chair, her spine like steel. "The evidence suggests—" "I don't want to hear about evidence that you shouldn't have been collecting in the first place," Mason cut in, his face flushing with anger. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're what, 6 months from retirement? Do you really want to spend them fighting battles you can't win?" "Captain, think about your pension, Harris. Think about ending your career quietly, with dignity." Mason's tone softened slightly, but his words carried a clear threat that made her stomach clench. "Don't throw away 30 years of service over this." Louise felt her jaw tighten as she fought to maintain her composure. "I can't ignore what I've found. This case isn't as simple as it appears." "It's exactly as simple as it appears," Mason countered, his knuckles white where they gripped his armrest. "A woman took a baby that wasn't hers. End of story. Drop the adoption agency angle or I'll have to take official action." Louise stood, her hands steady despite her racing heart and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I understand my position, sir, but I also understand my duty." Mason's face reddened to a dangerous shade. "That's your final answer?" "It is, sir." As Louise left Mason's office, frustration and determination warred inside her like opposing storms. She walked to her desk, where Xavier's crayon drawing sat next to her case files, its bright colors a reminder of why she couldn't back down. Her hand brushed over the papers, trembling slightly as she acknowledged exactly what she risked by continuing. But as she looked at the evidence she'd gathered, at the pattern of deceit that had emerged, she knew she couldn't stop now. Some fights were worth losing everything for. The evening light filtered weakly through the barred windows of the holding area, casting long shadows across the cold concrete floor. Amara sat on the hard wooden bench, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her body aching from hours of sitting on the unyielding surface. In her arms, she cradled Xavier's baby doll, her fingers absently smoothing its tattered pink dress. The plastic toy was a poor substitute for Ellie, but it gave her hands something to hold on to, a small comfort in this sterile place. The sound of measured footsteps echoing down the corridor made her look up. An officer appeared, keys jingling at his belt, and behind him stood Robert, looking uncomfortable in his wrinkled charcoal business suit. Amara's heart jumped, then settled into a defensive rhythm as she straightened her spine. "Mrs. Jackson," Robert said softly, gesturing to the metal chair across from her. "May I?" His voice carried a hint of uncertainty she'd never heard before. Amara nodded stiffly, watching as he lowered himself into the metal chair with careful movements. His hands fidgeted with his wedding ring, twisting it round, and several moments passed in tense silence, broken only by the distant sound of doors closing. "I met with Officer Harris today," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if sharing a secret. "She showed me some things about the adoption agency." He paused, struggling to meet her eyes, guilt written across his features. "I need to hear your side of the story, the whole truth, from you." Amara clutched the doll tighter against her chest like a shield. "Why? So you can use it against me in court?" "No." Robert shook his head emphatically, leaning forward. "Because I'm starting to think we might have been part of something wrong, something terrible." The unexpected sincerity in his voice made Amara's defenses waver. She studied his face carefully, seeing the genuine conflict there, the way his brow furrowed with concern. "The day I had Ellie," she began, her voice trembling with the weight of memories she'd tried to bury. "I was alone. No money, no support, not even a friend to hold my hand. The agency representatives were there before I'd even held her properly, hovering like vultures. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. They told me I'd be selfish to keep her when I couldn't provide for her. They waved the hospital bills in my face, said they'd make sure I'd never escape the debt if I didn't sign. They made me feel worthless." Robert leaned forward, his face paling visibly. "They threatened you? Actually threatened you?" "They didn't give me time to think," Amara continued, the words spilling out now. "Every time I hesitated, they reminded me how much everything cost. The delivery, the medications, the hospital stay. They had the papers ready before I'd even recovered from the birth, before the painkillers had worn off." Her voice cracked with emotion. "I never even got to say goodbye properly. They whisked her away so fast." Robert's hands clenched on the table until his knuckles turned white. "I didn't know," he whispered, shaking his head. "Carol and we were so focused on finally having a baby, we didn't question anything. The agency made everything seem so clean, so proper. We were just so happy to have Ellie." "She's my daughter," Amara said, touching the doll's face gently, imagining Ellie's soft cheeks. "I never wanted to give her up. I just didn't know I had a choice. They made sure of that." Robert stood slowly, his expression heavy with guilt and newfound understanding. "I need to think about what you've told me," he said, straightening his tie with trembling fingers. "I can't make any promises, but I hear you, Amara. I really do." "Thank you," Amara replied softly, watching as he turned toward the door. At the threshold, Robert paused, looking back at her with conflicted eyes before disappearing into the fluorescent-lit hallway, leaving her alone with her memories and a plastic doll. The clock struck 10 as Robert pulled into his driveway, his conversation with Amara still echoing in his mind. Through the living room window, he could see Carol's silhouette pacing back and forth, her movements sharp and agitated. His stomach tightened as he turned off the engine, the key trembling slightly in his hand. The moment he stepped inside, Carol whirled around to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling, and her usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled as if she'd been running her fingers through it repeatedly. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I called your office. You weren't there. I called 3 times." Robert set his keys down slowly, buying time, the soft clink against the hallway table seeming unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. "I went to see Amara." Carol's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief. "You did what?" I needed to hear her side. "Her side?" Carol's voice rose sharply, echoing off the walls. "There is no her side. She's a kidnapper who's trying to steal our baby, our little girl." "Carol, please," Robert said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "It's more complicated than that. The adoption agency dash." "Don't you dare!" Carol jabbed a finger at his chest, her wedding ring catching the light. "Don't you dare let her manipulate you like this. She's lying to you. Can't you see what she's doing to our family?" "I saw the evidence myself," Robert insisted, fighting to keep his voice steady. "The agency pressured her, threatened her with debt. They didn't give her time to—" "Stop it!" Carol's voice cracked like thin ice. "Just stop it. You're betraying everything we've built, everything we worked for, all those years of trying." Robert took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. "Did you ever question how quickly it all happened? How pushy they were about the paperwork? The way they rushed everything through?" Carol wrapped her arms around herself, turning away toward the window where streetlights cast long shadows across the lawn. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You'll never understand what it's like. Years of trying, years of failure. When they called about Ellie ... Her voice broke. "I couldn't risk losing her. I couldn't. She was our miracle." "So you ignored the red flags?" "Yes." Carol spun back to face him, tears streaming down her face, leaving dark mascara tracks. Yes, I ignored them, because I needed her. I needed to be a mother. And now you want to take that away from me too? Haven't I lost enough? Carol. No, Ellie is ours. She's my daughter. Carol's whole body shook with emotion, her fingers clutching at her sweater. You have no idea what infertility does to you, how it breaks you piece by piece. Ellie saved me, and I won't let anyone take her away, not Amara and not you. She stormed out of the living room, her footsteps thundering up the stairs, leaving Robert alone with the crushing weight of their crumbling world. He sank onto the couch, his eyes falling on the framed photo of Ellie on the coffee table. Her toothless smile stared back at him, innocent and unaware of the storm brewing around her, her blue eyes twinkling with the simple joy of childhood that seemed so far removed from the adult chaos surrounding her future. The morning sun cast long shadows across the police station's front steps as Carol strode through the entrance, her high heels clicking against the tile floor with sharp, angry precision. Behind her, a man in an expensive charcoal suit carried a leather briefcase, her lawyer, David Thompson. His perfectly styled silver hair and gold cufflinks screamed success and influence. Carol's face was a mask of determination, her red lipstick perfectly applied, her navy blazer crisp and unwrinkled, every detail of her appearance carefully controlled. I need to speak with Captain Mason immediately, she announced to the front desk officer, her voice carrying across the lobby. It's about pressing formal kidnapping charges. Louise looked up from her desk, her heart sinking like a stone, as she watched Carol and her lawyer being escorted to Mason's office. Through the glass windows, she could see Carol gesturing emphatically, while Mason nodded, his expression grave. Carol's hands trembled slightly despite her confident demeanor. After 20 minutes, they emerged from the office. Carol spotted Louise and made a beeline for her, her eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "Officer Harris," Carol said, her voice dripping with contempt, each word sharp as broken glass. "I hope you're happy with yourself, taking the side of a kidnapper." Louise stood her ground, squaring her shoulders. "I'm not taking sides, Mrs. Patterson. I'm investigating the truth." "The truth?" Carol let out a harsh laugh that held no humor. "The truth is that woman stole my baby, and you're helping her get away with it. I'll be filing a formal complaint about your conduct. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of officer you are." "You have every right to do that," Louise replied calmly, though her stomach churned. "But my job is to uncover all the facts." Carol leaned in close, her expensive perfume overwhelming, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried steel beneath its softness. "Listen carefully. I will not let anyone take Ellie away from me. Not Amara, not you, not anyone. Do you understand? I'll destroy anyone who tries." In the holding area, Amara sat on the narrow bed, the thin mattress barely cushioning the metal frame beneath, as an officer delivered the news about the formal charges. Her shoulders slumped, and she pressed her trembling hands to her face, trying to hold back tears that threatened to overwhelm her. "What's going to happen to Xavier?" she asked, her voice barely audible, cracking with fear. The officer explained that child services would be involved, making Amara's breath catch in her throat. The thought of losing both her children sent waves of panic through her body. Carol's heels echoed through the hallway like a countdown as she left the station, her lawyer in tow, head held high in victory. Louise watched from her desk, her jaw set with determination, fingers curling into fists at her sides. The stakes had just gotten much higher and time was running out to prove what really happened at the adoption agency. She couldn't let another mother lose her children to a broken system. The evening light faded outside the station windows as Xavier sat cross-legged in his usual corner, hunched over a piece of paper. His small hand moved mechanically across the page, the crayon making harsh strokes that seemed angry rather than artistic. Dark circles shadowed his young eyes, evidence of too many sleepless nights. Louise approached carefully, carrying a sandwich and a juice box she'd gotten from the break room vending machine. "Hey buddy, thought you might be hungry," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady and reassuring. Xavier didn't look up. His shoulders tensed and the crayon pressed harder against the paper, threatening to tear through. "You said you'd help my mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But now she's going to jail. You lied." His fingers trembled around the crayon. The accusation hit Louise like a physical blow, making her chest tighten painfully. She set the food down on a nearby chair and knelt beside him, careful to maintain some distance. "Xavier, I know things look bad right now, but I'm doing everything I can." "No!" Xavier pushed away from her, scattering his crayons across the floor with a clatter that echoed through the quiet station. "You're just like everyone else. You don't really care about us." His eyes filled with tears, making them shine in the dim light. "You promised to help, but Mom's still locked up and now they want to take me away too." His voice rose with each word, thick with emotion. "Please let me explain." Louise reached for him, her heart breaking at the sight of his distress. But Xavier jerked away as if her touch might burn him. "I don't want to hear it." He jumped to his feet, his small face contorted with hurt and betrayal, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. "You're supposed to be different. You're supposed to help people." He ran across the station, his footsteps echoing off the walls as he disappeared around the corner to the break room. Louise remained kneeling on the floor, surrounded by scattered crayons of every color. Each one felt like a piece of Xavier's broken trust scattered at her feet. She picked up the drawing he'd left behind. A family portrait now crossed out with angry black lines, the paper crumpled and torn at the edges. Back at her desk, Louise pulled out the photo of Lily she kept in her drawer, handling it with gentle fingers. Her daughter's smile, frozen in time, seemed to challenge her. The school photo had been taken just weeks before the accident. She remembered the day Lily died, how helpless she'd felt, unable to protect her own child. The memory still had the power to steal her breath. Now another child was suffering, and she had the power to do something about it. "I won't let him lose his family too," she whispered to Lily's photo, setting it carefully on her desk where it could watch over her work. Louise pulled the case files closer, spreading out the evidence she'd gathered across the worn surface. Her notes on the adoption agency's practices, Margaret's testimony, the financial records showing the coercion. It was all there, pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. She just needed to put it together in a way that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be brushed aside by those who'd rather look the other way. As the station grew quiet around her, the evening shift winding down to skeleton crew, Louise worked steadily, organizing her evidence and preparing her case. The gentle hum of fluorescent lights kept her company as she highlighted, annotated, and connected the dots. She knew what she had to do next, even if it meant risking everything: her career, her reputation, maybe even her freedom. Some things were worth the sacrifice. The morning sun barely peeked through the station windows as Louise stared at her phone, its screen reflecting the worry in her eyes. Coffee cups littered her desk, evidence of her sleepless night spent piecing together the puzzle. Files and documents spread across every surface told the story of a mother's desperation and an agency's manipulation, each page another thread in a web of deceit. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she dialed Robert's number. "Robert? It's Officer Harris. We need to talk somewhere private. It's important." An hour later, Louise sat on a weathered park bench, far from the usual walking paths where joggers and dog walkers wouldn't interrupt them. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Robert approached, his face tight with worry, his tie slightly askew as if he'd dressed in a hurry. "Thank you for coming," Louise said, gesturing to the thick stack of folders beside her. "What I'm about to show you, it could change everything. For all of us." One by one, she laid out the documents, each piece of paper another nail in the agency's coffin. Bank statements showing suspicious transactions that painted a clear picture of money-changing hands. Incomplete consent forms with rushed signatures, some dated at odd hours of the night. Margaret's sworn statement about the agency's tactics, detailed and damning. Robert's hands trembled as he picked up each piece of evidence, his face growing paler with every revelation. They pressured her when she was at her most vulnerable, Louise explained softly, watching his reactions carefully. Used her hospital bills as leverage. Threatened her with legal fees she couldn't possibly afford. They knew exactly what they were doing. Robert ran his fingers through his hair, leaving it standing on end. I knew something felt off about the whole process. Carol was so excited, so desperate to have Ellie. I didn't want to question it. I didn't want to see the signs. Robert, Louise leaned forward, her voice urgent but gentle, her eyes meeting his. If we don't stop this now, Amara will go to jail. Ellie will grow up never knowing the truth about her mother, about how she came to your family. Is that what you want for her? For your daughter to discover this years down the line? He stared at the documents, his face a mask of conflict and growing understanding. Carol, she'll never forgive me. This will destroy her. Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost, Louise said, remembering her own painful choices. But think about the cost of staying silent. Think about what that silence would mean. Robert gathered the papers together with shaking hands, tucking them carefully into his briefcase. I need time to think about this, to process it all. Time isn't something we have much of, Louise warned, standing up from the bench. Amara's hearing is coming up fast. Too fast. She watched as Robert walked away, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he'd learned. The morning breeze scattered a few loose papers across the dewy grass, and Louise gathered them up quickly, hoping she hadn't just made the biggest mistake of her career. But sometimes, she reminded herself, the right path was the hardest one to take. Robert sat alone in his study, the evening light casting long shadows across his cluttered desk. Papers and documents from Louise lay spread before him, each one a piece of a disturbing puzzle that made his chest tighten with every new revelation. His hands trembled as he picked up another bank statement, the numbers telling a story of manipulation and desperation that he couldn't ignore any longer. Through the wall, he could hear Ellie's sweet giggling as she played with her toys in the next room. The sound, usually a source of joy, now pierced his heart with guilt and made his throat constrict with emotion. Margaret's testimony hit him particularly hard, the words on the page seeming to burn into his consciousness. Her detailed account of the agency's tactics made his stomach turn and brought a bitter taste to his mouth. He remembered the day Carol had called him at work, breathless with excitement about finding an adoption agency that could help them quickly. Everything had happened so fast after that, like a whirlwind that swept away their better judgment. Memories flooded back, the adoption agent rushing them through paperwork in her fancy office, dodging their questions about the birth mother with practiced ease, insisting everything needed to be finalized immediately. He'd seen the doubt in the social worker's eyes, but had chosen to ignore it, pushing aside his own misgivings. Carol's happiness had seemed more important than asking difficult questions that might slow things down. Robert? Carol's voice startled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face, still wearing her garden gloves from working outside. You've been in here for hours. Is everything okay? His heart raced as he quickly gathered the papers, sliding them into a drawer with shaking hands. Just some work stuff, he managed, forcing a smile that felt brittle on his face. Pretty stressful case. Carol lingered, studying his face with the intensity that came from years of marriage. You seem different lately. Ever since. She trailed off, but they both knew she meant since Amara had come back into their lives, turning their world upside down. I'm fine, he assured her, though the words felt hollow. Just tired. After Carol left, Robert sat in the growing darkness, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway, his eyes fixed on the framed photo of Ellie on his desk, her first birthday, cake smeared across her happy face, her eyes bright with innocent joy. The weight of truth pressed down on him like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. With trembling fingers, he picked up his phone and found Louise's number. He stared at it for a long moment, knowing this call would change everything. His marriage, his family, his entire life. Finally, he pressed dial. Officer Harris? It's Robert. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. I'll testify. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow on the worn leather booths. The aroma of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air as the morning rush began to thin out. Louise sat across from Robert, watching him stir his untouched coffee for the third time. His shoulders were tense, but his eyes held determination. The ceramic mug clinked softly against the saucer with each nervous rotation of his spoon. I've been thinking about this all night, Robert said, his voice quiet but steady. "I need to make this right. I haven't slept much, but I know what I have to do." Louise nodded, pulling out her notebook and smoothing its wrinkled pages. "Before we start, you need to understand what you're getting into. This won't be easy, Robert. Carol ... will probably never forgive me," he finished, finally setting down his spoon with a soft clink. "I know. But every time I look at Ellie now, I see Amara's pain. I can't live with that anymore. The guilt is eating me alive." "Your marriage," Louise started, her voice gentle with concern. "Might end over this," Robert acknowledged, running a hand through his hair, his wedding ring catching the morning light. "But doing the right thing is more important than protecting a lie. I've protected it for too long already." Louise felt her heart ache for him even as she admired his courage. She'd seen many people choose the easier path, but Robert was willing to risk everything. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "There's more you should know," Robert said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I overheard conversations between Carol and the agency. They promised her they could handle any complications with Amara. They knew she was vulnerable. They targeted her specifically. They had a whole system for it." Louise's pen moved quickly across the page as Robert detailed meetings, conversations, and suspicious paperwork he'd witnessed. Each new piece of information strengthened their case against the agency. The waitress passed by, offering more coffee, but they both waved her away. "The day we signed the final papers," Robert continued, his voice thick with emotion, his fingers nervously shredding a paper napkin, "I saw Amara in the hallway. She was crying, begging to see her baby one last time. The agency rep just rushed her out, telling her she'd already signed away her rights." I'll never forget the sound of her voice. Louise looked up from her notes, seeing the pain etched across Robert's face. "This testimony could change everything," she said softly, reaching across to steady his trembling hands. "I hope so," Robert replied, standing to leave. "Because it's going to cost me everything. But maybe it'll help me sleep at night again." Louise gathered her evidence, watching him walk away. His shoulders seemed both lighter and heavier at the same time. The stack of papers and notes before her suddenly felt heavier with possibility and hope. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but for the first time in weeks, she felt they had a real chance at justice. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people filed into their seats, the wooden benches creaking under their weight. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Amara's hands trembled as she sat at the defendant's table. Her fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Deep breaths," Louise whispered, placing a reassuring hand on Amara's arm. "We've got this. Trust in the truth." Across the aisle, Carol sat rigidly beside her lawyer, her face a mask of cold determination, her perfectly pressed suit a stark contrast to her tense posture. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat next to her, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes fixed on the floor, occasionally glancing at his wife with a mix of concern and guilt. The prosecution opened with dramatic flair, gesturing broadly as they described Amara as a dangerous woman who let desperation drive her to kidnapping. Carol's testimony followed, her voice breaking as she described her love for Ellie, her shoulders shaking with barely contained emotion. "She's my daughter," Carol insisted, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "That woman has no right to her. She signed her rights away. I've been there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every milestone." When Louise's turn came, she approached the evidence methodically, her police training evident in her precise movements. She laid out document after document, building a clear picture of the adoption agency's misconduct. Margaret's testimony drew gasps from the spectators as she detailed the agency's practices, her former employer's secrets spilling into the open. "We were told to target vulnerable mothers," Margaret explained, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Women who couldn't afford lawyers, women who were alone. Like Amara. We had quotas to meet, and they didn't care how we met them." The courtroom fell completely silent when Robert took the stand, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Carol's face drained of color as he began to speak, her composure cracking for the first time. "I knew something wasn't right," Robert testified, his voice growing stronger with each word, his conscience finally winning out. "The agency rushed everything through. When I saw Amara begging to see her baby one last time, they just hustled her out the door. They told us not to worry about her emotional state, that it was normal. But it wasn't normal. None of it was normal. The look in her eyes haunts me to this day." The silence in the courtroom grew heavier as Robert detailed the agency's manipulation, his words echoing off the high ceiling. Carol sat frozen, her hands gripping the table edge until her fingers turned white, as her husband's words dismantled everything she'd been fighting for. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Robert concluded, his voice thick with emotion, wiping sweat from his brow. "They took advantage of a mother's desperation, both Amara's and Carol's. We were all pawns in their game." As Robert stepped down from the stand, Amara's eyes filled with grateful tears that sparkled in the afternoon light. Carol remained motionless, staring straight ahead with glassy eyes as the judge called for a recess before final arguments, the sharp rap of the gavel echoing through the hushed courtroom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows as everyone filed back in after the recess. Carol's heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way to the witness stand, each step echoing in the hushed room. Her lawyer gave her an encouraging nod, but her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness as she gripped the wooden edges of the stand, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. "Mrs. Patterson," her lawyer began gently smoothing his tie, "please tell the court about your journey to motherhood." Carol's voice quivered as she spoke. "We tried for 7 years to have a baby. 7 years of doctors, treatments, and heartbreak." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her wedding ring catching the light. "Every month brought new disappointment. I watched my friends have children, saw their families grow, while my arms stayed empty. The nursery we painted stayed quiet and dark." As she described finding the adoption agency, her voice grew stronger, taking on an almost defensive edge. When they called about Ellie, it felt like a miracle. She was perfect, everything we'd dreamed of. Carol's eyes softened as she spoke about her daughter, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "She's my whole world. Every first smile, first step, first word. I was there for all of it. I've been the one holding her through every fever, every nightmare." But during cross-examination, Carol's carefully constructed composure began to crack like thin ice under pressure. "Did you ever question why the adoption was processed so quickly?" Louise's attorney asked, his tone measured but firm. "No, I was just happy things were moving forward," Carol replied, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers fidgeting with the tissue. "Even when the agency rushed Ms. Jackson through the paperwork? When they wouldn't let her hold her baby one last time? I didn't..." Carol's voice cracked like brittle glass. Tears welled up in her eyes, smudging her mascara. "I didn't want to think about it. I couldn't bear the thought of losing another chance at being a mother. You can't imagine what that feels like." The courtroom fell silent as Carol broke down, the only sound her ragged breathing. "You don't understand what it's like," she sobbed, her shoulders hunching forward. "To want a child so badly it physically hurts. To feel broken, less than a woman." Her shoulders shook as she continued, her words coming out between gasps. "I didn't want to know the truth. I just wanted my baby. I just wanted to be a mother." As Carol stepped down from the stand, her makeup was streaked with tears, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled. She couldn't bring herself to look at Robert, who stared at his hands, his face etched with guilt and conflict. The judge called for a break as whispers filled the courtroom like rustling leaves. In the gallery, Louise watched with a mixture of sympathy and determination, knowing all too well the pain of maternal loss. The morning sun filtered through the high courtroom windows as people filed in for the final day of the trial. Every seat was filled, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, their hushed whispers creating a nervous undercurrent. Amara sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Louise's steady presence beside her offered what comfort it could, a gentle hand occasionally touching Amara's shoulder in silent support. In the gallery, Xavier perched on the edge of his seat, his young face a canvas of mixed emotions. His eyes darted between his mother and the judge's bench, hope and fear dancing across his features. He fidgeted with the hem of his carefully pressed shirt, the same one he'd worn on the first day of the trial. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise, court is now in session, the Honorable Judge William Matthews presiding." Judge Matthews settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the papers before him. The rustling of papers seemed deafening in the silent courtroom. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. "This case," he began, his voice measured and clear, "has presented us with extraordinary circumstances that require careful consideration." He looked up, scanning the faces before him, his expression grave, but compassionate. "The evidence presented has revealed deeply troubling practices within the adoption process." The judge detailed the evidence Louise had uncovered, particularly emphasizing Robert's testimony about the agency's questionable methods. His fingers tapped thoughtfully against the bench as he spoke. "The documentation shows clear signs of coercion, and the agency's actions fall well below acceptable ethical standards." Carol's shoulders trembled as the judge continued, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wooden barrier in front of her. "While I sympathize with both parties, Mrs. Patterson's desire for motherhood and Ms. Jackson's legitimate grievances, we must ensure justice is served." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the hushed courtroom. "Therefore, I am granting Ms. Jackson visitation rights while the court conducts a thorough review of custody arrangements. This is a temporary measure, but one I believe necessary to protect the interests of all parties, especially the child." Carol's face crumpled at the words while Robert reached for her hand, relief visible in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. A few rows back, someone let out an audible sigh. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you." Her voice trembled with emotion and gratitude. As people began to file out of the courtroom, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors, Amara rushed to Xavier, wrapping him in a tight embrace. Their tears mingled as they held each other, relief and joy radiating from their reunion. Louise watched from her position by the defense table, a quiet smile of satisfaction crossing her face as she witnessed justice being served. Her own eyes glistened with unshed tears as she gathered her papers, knowing that her fight for truth had finally made a difference. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police station steps as Amara emerged from the holding area, blinking against the harsh light. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she spotted Louise and Xavier waiting for her, their familiar figures a beacon of hope after the darkness of her cell. Xavier's small hand was wrapped tightly in Louise's, his sneakers scuffing nervously against the concrete. But the moment he saw his mother, he broke free and ran to her with desperate speed. "Mom!" he cried, throwing himself into her arms with such force that she stumbled back a step. Amara caught him, holding him close as if she'd never let go again, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and school clothes. "My baby," she whispered into his hair, her voice thick with emotion as her fingers tangled in his jacket. "I'm so sorry for everything, for all of this." Louise approached them slowly, her footsteps echoing softly on the concrete, giving mother and son a moment to reunite. When Amara looked up at her, her eyes were filled with gratitude and something deeper, a recognition of the bond they now shared. "Officer Harris, Louise, I don't even know how to thank you," Amara said, her voice trembling as she kept one arm wrapped tightly around Xavier. "You're like an angel sent to help us when we needed it most. Without you—" Louise shook her head, a warm smile spreading across her face as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just doing what's right," she said softly, though her eyes showed how much the words meant to her. They walked out of the station together, Amara taking deep breaths of the fresh air like it was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. Xavier kept a death grip on her hand, pressing close to her side with every step, as if afraid she might disappear again. The three of them paused on the sidewalk, letting the reality of the moment sink in as traffic passed by and pedestrians hurried past. "We should talk about arranging the visitation schedule," Louise said gently, her professional demeanor softening with understanding. "I can help you set up the preliminary meetings with Ellie. Make sure everything goes smoothly." Amara nodded, wiping away a tear with her free hand as hope bloomed in her chest. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly, standing straighter. "I'm never giving up on my family again. We'll make this work, won't we, Xavier?" Xavier nodded vigorously, squeezing his mother's hand even tighter, his face glowing with determination that matched hers. Louise pulled out her phone and started making notes, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "We'll need to coordinate with Carol and Robert's lawyer, but I think we can arrange the first visit for next week. I'll help you through the process every step of the way." "Thank you," Amara said again, her voice full of determination and hope as she pulled Xavier closer to her side. "For everything. For believing in us." As Amara and Xavier turned to leave, walking hand in hand down the sidewalk, Louise watched them go, their shadows stretching long behind them in the late afternoon light. A sense of pride and fulfillment filled her chest as she saw them together, mother and son reunited at last, their steps perfectly in sync as they headed toward their future. The evening settled heavily over the Patterson home, its silence broken only by the soft hum of the baby monitor, carrying Ellie's gentle breathing from upstairs. The familiar sounds of their daughter's peaceful slumber felt different tonight, heavier somehow with the weight of what had happened in court. Carol sat rigid on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap while Robert occupied his usual armchair, the distance between them feeling like miles. "I can't do this anymore," Carol finally said, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp with pain. Her fingers twisted the fabric of her shirt, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years. Robert looked up, his face etched with exhaustion. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper tonight, carved by stress and sleepless nights. He'd been expecting this conversation since leaving the courthouse, but that didn't make it any easier. "You betrayed me," Carol continued, her voice rising slightly. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears in the dim living room light. "You sided with her, with Amara. After everything we've been through together, how could you do this to us?" "I had to tell the truth," Robert replied softly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his decision. "What the agency did, what we allowed them to do, it wasn't right." "Right?" Carol's laugh was bitter, echoing off the walls like broken glass. "What about what's right for me? For us? I can't even look at you anymore without seeing someone I don't trust." She stood up abruptly, pacing the room, her sock-covered feet making soft sounds against the carpet. "All these years together, building our family, trying for a baby, and you just threw it all away." "I did what was right for Ellie," Robert insisted, his voice firm but gentle. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, anchoring himself. "She deserves to know the truth about where she came from. We can't build our family on lies." "Stop saying that." Carol's control finally broke, her voice cracking like thin ice. "You're talking about our daughter like she's some kind of... like she doesn't belong to us." Without warning, Carol strode to their bedroom, her movements sharp and jerky with anger. Robert could hear drawers being yanked open, clothes rustling, hangers scraping against the rod in the closet. When she emerged, she carried a hastily packed overnight bag, stuffed with whatever clothes she could grab first. "I'm leaving," she announced, her voice thick with tears that now flowed freely down her cheeks. "I can't stay here with someone who'd destroy everything we built together." Robert watched silently as Carol walked to the door, her footsteps heavy with finality. She paused for just a moment, her hand on the doorknob, as if waiting for him to stop her, before walking out into the night. The sound of her car starting up and pulling away felt like a physical blow. The house felt impossibly empty in her wake, filled with the kind of silence that screams of absence. Robert sat alone in the living room, his eyes fixed on the family photo on the mantel. Ellie's bright smile captured forever in a wooden frame, Carol's arms wrapped protectively around her, his own face beaming with joy. Despite the ache in his chest, he felt a surprising sense of peace. He knew he'd made the right choice, even if it had cost him his marriage. Sometimes he realized doing the right thing meant losing what you thought you couldn't live without. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over Amara and Xavier's breakfast table. The cheerful rays felt like a promise of better days ahead, painting golden patterns across their worn but clean tablecloth. Xavier spooned cereal into his mouth. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks, the familiar comfort of home evident in his posture. "Want some more orange juice?" Amara asked, noticing his empty glass. She loved these quiet moments with her son, treasuring every small detail. Xavier nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yes, please." His voice carried a contentment that made her heart swell. As she poured the juice, Amara noticed how the shadows under Xavier's eyes had faded. His whole demeanor had changed since they'd returned home together, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his young shoulders. Later that morning, Amara walked into the local community center, her head held high despite her nervousness. The freshly painted walls and encouraging posters made the space feel welcoming. The receptionist greeted her warmly, directing her to a bulletin board covered in colorful flyers. "We have weekly support groups for single mothers," the receptionist explained, her voice kind and understanding. "And there's a job fair next Tuesday. Several companies are hiring. They're all family-friendly employers." Amara jotted down the details, hope blooming in her chest. On her way out, she called the family counselor Louise had recommended, scheduling their first session. Each small step forward felt like a victory. Meanwhile, Xavier adjusted his backpack as he walked into his classroom, the familiar sounds and smells of school surrounding him. His best friend Tommy immediately waved him over, practically bouncing with excitement. "We missed you," Tommy exclaimed, his face lighting up. "Want to sit together at lunch? I saved your favorite spot by the window." Back home, Amara spread the handmade quilt across her bed, checking every stitch with careful fingers. She'd started it during her pregnancy, imagining wrapping her baby girl in its soft warmth, each pattern selected with love. Now, finally, she would give it to Ellie, the moment she'd dreamed of for so long. Louise stopped by that afternoon, bringing coffee and encouragement. They sat at the kitchen table, talking like old friends, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. "Are you nervous about tomorrow's visit?" Louise asked gently, warming her hands around her coffee mug. "A little," Amara admitted, fidgeting with her cup, "but mostly excited. I just want to hold her." Her voice trembled slightly with emotion. Louise reached across the table, squeezing Amara's hand. "You're doing great. Both of you are." Her eyes held the warmth and understanding of someone who truly cared. As Amara carefully folded the quilt and placed it in a gift bag, Xavier watched from the doorway, his eyes following her movements. She turned to him, her eyes full of love and determination, seeing both her little boy and the strong young man he was becoming. "We're going to be okay," she promised, "no matter what." Xavier nodded, offering a small but genuine smile that warmed Amara's heart, a smile that held all the trust and hope a son could have for his mother. Louise sat alone on a weathered park bench, the autumn breeze rustling through the trees overhead. Children's laughter filled the air as families gathered on the playground nearby, their voices carrying across the crisp October afternoon. She held a worn photograph in her hands, her thumb gently tracing the image of a smiling teenage girl with her same brown eyes and that familiar dimpled grin. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, remembering the day she'd taken this photo. They'd had a picnic right here in this park, spreading their checkered blanket under the maple trees. Lily had been so full of life that day, her hair catching the sunlight as she ran through the grass, begging her mom to take just one more picture, between bites of peanut butter sandwiches. The case with Amara and Xavier had stirred something deep within Louise, awakening feelings she'd buried years ago. For years after losing Lily, she'd thrown herself into work, building walls around her heart, taking extra shifts and avoiding anything that might remind her of motherhood. But watching Xavier's unwavering faith in his mother and Amara's fierce determination to protect her children had cracked those defenses, letting light seep through. She thought about the risks she'd taken, defying Captain Mason's orders, sharing confidential information with Robert, pushing boundaries she'd always respected before. Her career had been built on following protocol, yet here she was breaking rules she once thought sacred. By all accounts, she should feel worried about the consequences. Instead, she felt lighter, more purposeful than she had in years, as if she'd finally remembered who she truly was. Retirement loomed just months away, with her farewell party already penciled into the department calendar. Before the case, she'd dreaded it, seeing only empty days stretching ahead like an endless highway. Now possibilities bloomed in her mind like spring flowers. The local community center always needed volunteers, and she'd seen their flyers asking for mentors. Maybe she could mentor young women interested in law enforcement, sharing her experiences and wisdom, helping them navigate the challenges she'd faced. "I'm not done helping families," she said quietly to herself, tucking Lily's photo back into her wallet where it had lived for the past 12 years. "I'm just getting started in a different way." A young mother caught her eye, chasing her giggling toddler across the grass, both of them red-cheeked and breathless with joy. Louise smiled softly at the scene, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. The past weeks had taught her so much about love, sacrifice, and what justice really meant. Lessons that went far beyond any police academy training. Amara's hands trembled as she clutched the carefully wrapped quilt outside the Sweet Bean Cafe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as she checked her watch for the 5th time, her stomach doing nervous flips. A few early customers hurried past with their to-go cups, barely noticing her anxiety. Her heart skipped when she spotted Robert walking towards her, his shoulders tense but his expression open, his pace measured and deliberate. "Hi," she said softly, adjusting her grip on the gift, her fingers running along the crisp edges of the wrapping paper. "Good morning, Amara." Robert gestured to a table on the quiet patio, where potted flowers added splashes of cheerful color. "Shall we?" They sat down, an awkward silence hanging between them until their coffee arrived. The rich aroma of freshly ground beans drifted between them as Robert wrapped his hands around his mug, taking a deep breath. "I need to apologize," he started, his voice thick with emotion, eyes fixed on the swirling cream in his coffee. "I knew something wasn't right with the adoption. I saw the red flags, but I ignored them because Carol wanted a baby so badly." He met Amara's eyes, his own glistening slightly. "I failed you, and I failed Ellie." Amara's fingers loosened their death grip on the gift in her lap, her knuckles slowly regaining their color. She hadn't expected this level of honesty from him, this raw vulnerability. "You're trying to make it right now," she said, her voice gentle. "That counts for something." "I want us to figure out how to do this together," Robert continued, leaning forward slightly. "Ellie deserves to know both her parents. She deserves all the love we can give her." They spent the next hour working out details, their coffee growing cold as they talked. Weekly visits would start small, just an hour or two at first. They'd gradually increase the time as Ellie adjusted. Robert suggested a child therapist he'd researched who specialized in adoption cases, showing Amara the woman's credentials on his phone. "I was thinking," Robert said, absently stirring his coffee. "Maybe we could start with supervised visits at the park near my house. Ellie loves the swings there. It might help her feel more comfortable. She's always laughing when she's on them." Amara nodded, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. "I'd like that. I brought something for her." She placed the wrapped package on the table, her hands smoothing over the paper one last time. "It's a quilt. I started making it when I was pregnant with her." Robert smiled gently, his eyes softening. "She'll love it. She's always grabbing for soft things to cuddle with. She has this little blanket she carries everywhere." As they stood to leave, Amara felt a weight lift from her shoulders, like she could finally take a full breath again. "Thank you," she said, meaning every word, "for giving me a chance to be part of her life." "We'll take it one step at a time," Robert assured her, his voice steady and kind. "That's all we can do." The sunlight filtered through the leaves of the old oak tree, casting dappled shadows on the checkered picnic blanket below. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of nearby flowering bushes, as Amara watched Xavier showing Ellie how to hold the baby doll, his hands gentle as he guided his little sister's arms. "Like this," Xavier said softly, adjusting her grip with patient care. "You have to support the head, see? Just like Mom taught me when you were little." Ellie giggled, mimicking her brother's careful movements with complete concentration. The doll that once represented so much pain now brought joy, connecting the siblings in a way that made Amara's heart swell with gratitude and love. They spread out their simple lunch: peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles, crisp apple slices arranged in a star pattern, and juice boxes still cold from the cooler. The sound of children playing nearby mixed with their own laughter as Xavier told silly jokes that made Ellie squeal with delight, her tiny pigtails bouncing with each giggle. Louise appeared, her off-duty clothes a refreshing change from her usual uniform, carrying a Tupperware container of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. "Room for one more?" she asked with a warm smile, settling down on the blanket and tucking her legs underneath her. "Cookie," Ellie exclaimed, reaching out with tiny hands, her eyes wide with excitement. As they shared the treats, Ellie crawled into Amara's lap, cookie crumbs dotting her chin and shirt front. She looked up with bright eyes and said clearly, her voice full of trust, "Mommy, more please?" Amara froze, tears welling up instantly. She hugged Ellie close, breathing in the sweet baby shampoo scent of her hair, savoring the moment she'd dreamed of for so long. Louise watched them with misty eyes, remembering how far they'd come from that desperate, stormy night at the police station. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. "I start my medical assistant program next month," Amara shared proudly, running her fingers through Ellie's soft curls. "The community center helped me get a scholarship. They even arranged for childcare during my evening classes." "I'm going to be an animal doctor," Xavier announced proudly, sitting up straighter. "I've been reading all about it at the library. Ms. Johnson even gave me some special books about veterinary medicine." Robert arrived right on schedule, walking across the grass with a friendly wave, his briefcase from work still in hand. "How was everyone's afternoon?" "Daddy!" Ellie ran to him, then turned back to point at Amara, her face beaming. "Mommy gave me cookies." Robert smiled warmly, genuine affection in his eyes. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Did you say thank you?" The exchange was natural, peaceful, a far cry from the tension-filled courtroom days that seemed like a distant memory now. As Robert gathered Ellie's things, he and Amara discussed the upcoming week's schedule with easy familiarity, coordinating piano lessons and doctor appointments. Louise stood brushing grass from her pants. She watched the scene unfold, this family that had found its own unique way to heal and grow together, proving that love could bridge any divide. With a quiet smile of satisfaction, she turned and walked away from the park, leaving them to their newfound harmony. Amara and Xavier waved goodbye, their faces bright with hope and contentment as they packed up their picnic and headed home together, hand in hand under the golden afternoon sun. If you enjoyed the story of Amara, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.